at Lehigh University, and this is the eighth seminar this fall semester. And the theme of the seminar has been about energy transition. We heard talks from representatives from India, from Uruguay, and most recently we had a presentation on electrification from an EPRI representative, and I'm really pleased to have Dr. Tom TerBush, one of my favorite speakers from EPRI. He's the director and of, I'm sorry, he's the president of EPRI International and vice president of sales and and technical services. His talk will be about energy transition in Europe. He's accountable for EPRI's collaborative engagement with members and partner organizations in the US and in over 45 other countries in support of EPRI's mission to drive innovation to ensure the public has safe, reliable, affordable, and clean energy around the globe. Since joining EPRI in 1997, Tom has held a wide range of positions in Europe, Asia, and North America, involving economics, nuclear power delivery, sales and marketing, and technology transfer. Prior to EPRI, he worked with US and Japanese organizations in energy economics, technology, and deregulation. Tom has a Ph.D. in economics from George Mason University, where he developed expertise in energy economics and the interplay of energy regulation, energy markets, and economic performance. So before Tom takes the floor, he's agreed to taking questions during his presentation. So if you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask Tom the question. Make sure you do it in time so that he doesn't miss you. I mean, you go right past his talk. So anyway, you're free to kind of ask him questions during the talk, and of course we'll have a question and answer session lasting for about 30 minutes before my seminar ends. Without further ado, Tom, you're on.
All right. Thanks, Rudy. Well, thanks for having me on. Obviously, we've known each other for a long time. I can remember it was almost 20 years ago, when you were at EPRI, that we were in the trenches working together. It's good to see you, and we still look pretty young. So, things have worked out. Anyways, I appreciate you being here. Today, I really want to talk, obviously, we'll talk about European energy transition. Really want probably to divide at least my discussion into three parts. One, kind of where Europe is with energy right now and how they got there. Two will be where they want to go. And three, the myriad challenges they have to get to where they want to go, whether it's 2030, 2040, 2050. And obviously, I'm an American. I live in France for EPRI. I've been there on and off, actually, since 2012. I was in Japan 20 years ago for EPRI. So, for me, and I know some of you are grad students or students in the engineering program at Lehigh, one of my biggest takeaways from my EPRI career has been really the power. Some people, I guess, in academia call it interdisciplinary, right? You learn one discipline and you go to another discipline, apply, or you worked alongside others in other disciplines. And I think a lot of you on this, certainly I've learned the power of whether it's being American in Europe and taking American perceptions on what's regulation, technology, innovation, applying it there, whether it's being, electrical engineer, working with chemical engineers, whether it's, one of the strongest programs at EPRI really takes innovation from the medical industry. This is the non-destructive examination program. The medical industry spends billions of dollars developing all these amazing tools to peer inside the human body non-destructively. The nuclear and fossil industries have been doing a great job, with EPRI very much in the center of that, taking these same tools and applying them to metals, right? Metal components, things that are hard to look at, welds, these sorts of things. It's always amazing to me. So again, I'm not European. I haven't lived in Europe my whole life. I'm not the expert in Europe. In fact, my job is much bigger than Europe, so I don't spend all my time thinking about Europe. But I think going in there, innovation is really driven by cross-pollination. We learn a lot from Europe. Europe learns a lot from the US. think there'll be some interesting outsider perspective that I can at least walk you through. There's a lot of things good and bad that are going on in Europe, and I'm not in a position to defend or attack any of those, but it is pretty interesting how fast they're moving. So as we'll talk about a little bit of that, I want to get my slide up. Let's see. Just give me a minute to share the slide. I only have 2 slides. I'm going to use this slide for kind of as a jumping off point. Let me figure out how to do that. Screen. All right. Let's see here. All right, great. All right, so everybody can see that. Let's just talk about where Europe is. And, you know, this map, this is CO2 energy emissions per capita in 2022. And this map tells us as much about where Europe's been as where it is. This is where it is in terms of emissions today. There's a lot of layers to this, right? So if you look back at the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, led by the UK, and obviously the US wasn't far behind. These, you know, the number one factor to carbon, you know, CO2 emissions per capita is really industrialization. How much did you industrialize? When did you industrialize? How fast did you industrialize? UK was first in Europe, in the world, but pretty soon after you saw France, Germany, all those countries kind of in the center to the left. So there, you know, as these countries became industrialized and wealthy, if you had this chart from 150 years ago, which we could do, you'd see it would be a very different chart. There'd be biomass being used everywhere, and then a certain CO2 footprint, but you'd have a lot of factories and things up in the Northwest. And this chart would look probably a little uglier than it is today, certainly a little bit more split. So, you know, the first lesson from 100 years ago or more is carbon emissions, obviously driven by industry. It mattered, you know, they all went on coal, they went with oil. But by the mid-20th century, you started seeing differentiation. Yes, the richer, more industrialized countries were still pretty energy intensive, pretty CO2 intensive. But as people started building out hydroelectric, like up in the north, you know, it's pretty similar to North America. You know, in Canada, they're blessed with a lot of hydro resources. So those guys always had lower CO2 emissions on the electricity side, at least, because they were able to tap hydro. Other countries made choices with nuclear. So obviously France being the most obvious one historically on the industrial electricity side has had a lower CO2 emissions per capita. But, you know, also other, you know, Spain, Germany, UK, they also embraced this as well. So those choices made mid-century also then sort of evolved this chart further. And we could sit here and talk about the charts all day. I'm just trying to talk about how we got here. So hydro, nuclear, and then, you know, by the 80s, well, mid-century towards 70s, 80s, they started embracing natural gas, which started crowding out coal, other sorts of heavier fossil, more intense fossil molecules. And so, and you know, by obviously this made them very, and we'll talk about this in the challenge side, as they started embracing gas, in some places it drove down their carbon emissions, but it made them more vulnerable, obviously, to where they were getting that gas from. So, and then you look, you know, as rich countries started moving from industrial to services, you start seeing a deindustrialization in some of these countries. Has helped them bring their CO2 emissions down, but doesn't tell the whole story, right? So if you're importing your industrial goods from India, from China, from other places, this isn't really accounting for the import fraction of your CO2 emissions. So that's obviously a pretty important picture. They're still not accounting for that today with their goals, but obviously we're going to need to do that at some point. And then obviously for the last 25, 30 years, it's been about decarbonization. So you can see the countries to the south and to the west. Well, let's put the southeast and southwest and the west have been very strong on decarbonization, and they've been driving their numbers down. Countries to the southeast, that there is definitely decarbonization going on, but a lot of that has to do just with those countries were never quite as wealthy, say, as Germany, as France, as UK. They probably weren't as carbon intense. You know, again, it's all about the choices that they made. So, you know, France was probably about, if you go back to 1990 on this chart, France, which is at 4.8 now, they were probably about 7. Germany was 12. Poland was about the same. They were about 9. UK was over 10. So UK has actually made very good progress, right? They just shut down their last coal plant this year. You see a lot of progress being made. They've got a long way to go. and they've got a lot of ambitions about how they're going to get there. If you look at the top right, you see that there's the US is on there, right? So obviously the way the heat map works is the cooler it is, the lower your emissions per capita, the hotter, the redder, the worse. And so, you see US and China, or sorry, US and Australia, pretty high. China actually on a per capita basis is more in the range of, say, a Poland or Germany. Just again, they're not, even though they're very industrialized, we're starting to see that level off a bit, just because, if you really look at what's happening in China, they're rolling out so much. They're building coal plants, but that's slowing down a little bit. They're rolling out so much renewables, wind, solar. They're deploying more than the rest of the world combined right now. So we'll probably see that tamped down a little bit. But, actually, Europe's in a pretty good place. And that part of its choices they made for the last 150 years, but especially choices, at least in a lot of these green cases, choices they've made in the last 30 years to decarbonize. And of course, they're not at all satisfied with this. So they still have a long way to go. Just a little bit more about Europe. It's probably in some ways comparable to North America. They probably have about 1,100 installed gigawatts right now on the electricity side. A lot of gas, less and less coal, but certainly the farther east you go, the more coal there is. Of that 1,100 gigawatts right now, and this is probably just EU. I think if you throw in UK, Norway, Switzerland, maybe you get closer to, say, 12. About half of their installed capacity right now is renewables, and not even hydro. Just half is wind and solar. Wind is closing in on 300 gigawatts. I'd say about 10% of that is offshore, and that's growing. And pretty quickly, solar is about 220, maybe 230 gigawatts, also growing very rapidly. Obviously, there's some differences between the US and Europe in terms of I think historically their energy use per capita is lower than us. I think the rule of thumb used to be, I've been looked at it recently, used to be that Europe, the EU countries mainly compared to the United States, used about half as much energy per person, at least half as much electricity back in the day. And then when I lived in Japan, Japan was using half of Europe. So obviously this actually influences your energy intensity and your CO2 emissions quite a bit if on a per capita basis you're using a lot less energy. So that's part of what we see here today too, not just the choices in decarbonization. So that's where they are, kind of where they've been, how they've gotten here. Should probably talk a little bit now. We'll kind of slide into where they want to go. So look at this chart. That black dashed line is CO2 emissions. So it's going back to 2000. They're actually, let me see, they're down about 37%. Their CO2 emissions are down about 37% since 1990. They beat their 2022 targets, and they have a very aggressive 2030 target of 55% reduction. And we'll talk in a minute about how incredibly aggressive that is and all the things they're trying to do with 6 years left to try to accomplish that. It's there's a lot of, they're going through a lot of pain on this right now. If you look at the fuel mix, and again, this is economy-wide, energy-wide. This is not just electricity, this is all energy. You see oil is still a pretty large fraction of things, right? So oil is that big, I don't know what color it's showing up on Zoom, but the big mustard piece in the middle. Obviously, transportation is still driving that. Gas is still quite big, right? So yes, they took a hit. They're using less gas now than they were, say, 3 years ago before Russia invaded Ukraine. But they basically swapped out imports from Russia to imports from the US and other LNG folks. So they're still using a lot of gas, and clearly they're going to be doing that for a while, no matter how much they squeeze it out. Coal, looks probably a little bit like the US, except obviously we're using a lot more still in percentage terms than they are. Coal, they're squeezing out. I mean, if you look at where we are right now, 2024, they're using a third of what they were using in 2000. Certainly a third of what they were using in 1990. So they're making good progress on that. And obviously, then this is their forecasted. This is again from Bloomberg on, they do their economy-wide model. They're looking at how they're going to replace all that. You see in the top, you see wind and solar coming in. Their numbers are good, but they got a long way to go economy-wide again, right? So electricity is only 23% of end use of energy. So even if you do, if you replace all electricity with renewables, nuclear. It's only 23% of the picture. They got to tackle the rest. And so that's what they're working on as well. Obviously, on the electricity side, they're making good progress, but they still have a long way to go. And we'll kind of talk about what that means. They're counting on wind. You can see here they've got a lot of wind projects, and they're scaling. They're going offshore. The numbers right now, if you look at the build that they have to do in the next 6 years, it's gigantic. I mean, they're going from this little wedge that you see if you kind of look halfway between 2020 and 2030 to a much larger wedge. And I have the numbers written down somewhere, I don't have the top of my head, but they have to build a lot. They've got a lot of barriers to doing that. We'll talk about the challenges, but they're really banking a lot on wind. If you think about what else they're going to have to bank on, and the nuclear wedge in this forecast gets less and less, that can't, for them, I think you're seeing in Europe right now, historically, you had countries that were nuclear and countries that weren't nuclear. Over the last 30 years, 40 years, you've seen some countries turn a little bit more anti-nuclear. Germany has sworn off nuclear. They've shut down their nuclear plants. It looked like Sweden was going to go that way. Belgium, Spain, well, Italy never really went nuclear because they swore it off before they got started. But what we're seeing right now, I'd say it's really been accelerated over the last 3 to 4 years, partially because of the precious energy transition, and people need to get to their 2050 targets, let alone their 2030 targets. But we're also seeing, because Russian gas getting cut off, they're really struggling for self-sufficient, sustainable solutions on the firm power side. So, I think we're seeing a lot of interest now. Certainly a lot of countries like France are doubling down on nuclear. Obviously, Ukraine's doubling down nuclear. Sweden's planning to do nuclear, more nuclear. Poland is looking very serious. So, they've already got technology selections, and they're working with Westinghouse and others to go nuclear. We see Czech Republic's going to build more nuclear. A lot of countries in Europe right now are looking at more and more nuclear, and that's going to be part of that wedge. But obviously, if they start now, it's not going to really impact their 2030 decarbonization plans. So it's more of a longer term play, but that's one obvious glaring default from this chart, which is if you really walk away from nuclear, you're really betting the farm on, well, basically wind. That's what has to come in hard, plus a lot of solar. And obviously, with that much intermittent resource, it's going to take a lot of work, and they're banking on batteries and hydrogen and other things to balance it out, especially if they squeeze out gas. So, and then we talk about hydrogen, it doesn't really show up in here because that's how they're trying to decarbonize other sectors of the economy, right? So they're trying to decarbonize maybe as just an energy carrier, use more hydrogen. If anybody's looked at hydrogen, we know how difficult that is. There's all sorts of challenges with hydrogen, but they've been spending way more money in the United States on hydrogen. They've been working on hydrogen a long time. There's a sentiment in Europe right now that hydrogen's a lot tougher than they hoped it would be. It's certainly not going to come online in time for 2030, early 2030s. It's going to take a lot of work. The price points, all the things that hydrogen pessimists were thinking all along seems to be proving true, right? So hydrogen might help them in some extreme cases in the near term, say within the next 10 years on energy storage a bit. In extreme cases, they're looking at doing things with swapping wind for transmission, getting around transmission congestion in certain places by swapping out to hydrogen. And obviously, probably the most obvious thing will be hard to decarbonize industrial applications, shipping even, but certainly, other things where they actually need an amount of heat that they're having trouble generating at cost with electricity. So that's kind of where they're looking at. They've got let's see, if you look at their goal for so they're 55%, they want to be 55% lower on CO2 emissions from energy by 2030 compared to 1990. They had a target, they had a target for renewables to get to, I think, 22.5% of all energy. And this includes hydro. By 2022, they've done that, they hit that. They have a target to get to 42.5% by 2030. That's where the lift, right? So they're talking about almost doubling their renewables as final energy, not just even electricity, but final energy consumption, and making that renewables incredibly ambitious. So that's going to take a lot of work. Obviously looking at heating for buildings. Buildings are big. They have a lot of old buildings. It's not like the US where we build things, tear it down, build new things. In Europe, they got a lot of buildings that have been there for a long time. How do you actually bring down emissions to buildings? And we'll talk about the challenges they're having on electrification, which is going maybe slower there than it is even in the United States. All right, so I don't know if anybody has questions on that bit. That's kind of history, where they're aiming for. We're going to try and kind of get more in the weeds now on challenges, kind of bit by bit. We'll kind of look at like every pillar of challenge that they have and how they're getting over that. So let me know if you have any questions about any of that. I'll pause for a minute and let me stop sharing too.
Questions for Tom? Tom, when you talk about certain countries are expanding their nuclear, are the designs Western design, or are they Russian design, or are they even?
So it's a good question. Basically, I would think Eastern Europe might have been in play for Russian design slightly before they invaded Ukraine the second time back in 2022. Right now, Russia is completely off the table. That being said, we do know globally, Russia is very much in the game, right? Turkey, Egypt, Bangladesh, Africa. Russians are outselling US vendors right now, globally, outside, in the developing world, let's put it. So they're very active, but I think Europe is, suppose Hungary might play footsie with the Russians and want to build a Russian reactor, but I think generally Europe has gotten over Russia. And I think a lot of those Eastern European countries didn't ever want to really go back to the Russians to begin with.
So what about small modular reactors, which is kind of high here in the US? How's it there?
That's a good question. So on the vendor side, obviously, we've got lots and lots of technology vendors in North America, especially in the US. We also have several in the UK. And then we've got, I'd say France is trying to support some vendors, like through Ariba, now EDF. They've kind of created a lot of startups. So on the demand side from the countries in Europe, definitely very interested in SMRs, right? So, you have to, I think the farther east you go, the more likely they are to embrace it faster. But a lot of them have very aggressive targets. They're a little bit behind the folks in the west of Europe. And so they're going to go probably where they can. They're going to go full scale for, Gen 3 plus type AP1000s and KHNP reactors, the French EPR. But definitely, no, the SMR vendors are all over Europe. There's a lot of interest. I think Romania is already kind of working with whatchamacallit to do some siting and technology, basically working on things. So yeah, we do see it. The farther east you go, I think you'll see more, where the grids aren't quite as built out and as big, and they need they need to replace smaller coal plants with something firm.
Yeah. Okay, there's a question in the chat box from Claudia. It is interesting that the energy from the oceans is not playing a bigger role in that roadmap. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Historically, Scotland, up in the the Irish Sea and the North Sea, there's been a lot of work on wave energy, ocean energy in Scotland. It's tough. The pound, there's big projects going on right now. So there's a lot of hope, but bringing in a cost, there's a lot of innovation going on, but right now they have not gotten to a point where they can scale something up. So obviously we're optimistic. We've done, I know, Rudy, you might remember, even EPRI's worked with folks in the San Francisco Bay, right there at the Golden Gate, doing ocean energy. And we've done a lot of projects over the years. It's one of those things people keep pushing, but it feels like it's still got a ways to go. I think there's a lot of people that have probably higher hopes right now in geothermal, like deep geothermal. Again, challenges, but there's, I think, more money going to geothermal right now.
I think
more
Corey
money going to fusion.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I think Corey has his hand up. Go
Corey?
ahead.
Good afternoon. Corey Martin, ESE grad student. What causes on the graph that you displayed earlier, what causes the emission line on the black line to be higher up prior to 2020, apart from the emission generated from the energy sources? So
why are emissions higher in the past and they've been going down? Well, Yeah, so it's a good question. Obviously, over time, they've been shutting, well, especially over the last 20, 30 years, they've been shutting down fossil facilities and replacing them with renewables. There's been energy efficiency, and also a bit like the US, but more so, energy demand has been pretty flat in Europe for a while. In fact, electricity demand is down 6 or 7% over the last 2 or 3 years. And part of that is just they had to tighten their belts when Russia cut off the gas, or they cut off the Russian gas. Russia didn't really cut it off. But there's a lot of factors driving, more efficiency, a little bit of electrification. It's really shutting down older, more emitting facilities or using them less and replacing them. They've got a lot of renewables on the system right now that they're definitely harnessing. So it all puts downward pressure. I think another thing you'll see is in certainly recently deindustrialization. Germany is having a tough time right now with the Russian gas cut off. I think I was just looking at German, even the electricity system peak is down 25% over the last 3 years. So German industry, when the Russian gas first got cut off, they were basically told by the government, the system operators, you just need to shut down. You were running 24 hours a day, you're running 8 hours next week a day. They were having to ration gas, basically, through prices somewhat, but also they didn't want industry sucking up all the gas and people freezing to death in their houses, obviously. So they had to kind of balance the gas that first winter, back 22, 2023. And between taking the hit on higher energy prices, inflation, and competition from China, Germany's a lot of problem. Germany is having a lot of trouble. So just German, when they're the industrial powerhouse of Europe, just them going down by whatever their industry is down by quite a bit, that also has downward pressure the last couple of years. So there's a bit of a blip there, at least. Hopefully they can bounce back, not on their carbon emissions so much as their industrial production.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
I think there's a question in the chat real quick from Dan Chapley. He asked, who is paying for the Russian nuclear that they are selling?
Good question. Well, what the Russians have been doing, they're very flexible, but they basically go in and they do a turnkey model. And ultimately the governments, right? So the government of Turkey, through a state-owned utility, would be paying for the Russian nuclear plant. Egypt the same way, Bangladesh, I guess, African countries. What Russia does is they go in with a turnkey concept. They say, listen, we'll build it, we'll site it, we'll build it, we'll train people to run it, we'll basically manage that plant as if it's not even in your country. You just sign us a contract for energy, and we'll give this to you. We'll even take the waste. They're basically, they're obviously not everybody signs off on that. Some countries want to be able to run the plant themselves, and the Russians are willing to do whatever it takes at, I guess, much lower costs, I think, than the US or Korea or France. So the money's coming from state governments.
Here's another question in the chat box. Has the EU given consideration to load growth due to climate change and the need for the use of air conditioning in the future and the eventual need to data centers? Yeah,
that's a good question. So the data centers one is happening a lot faster than the air conditioning load growth. If you look at what they've been projecting, and then again, we can kind of move into the challenge phase. So I'll talk about one, which is, electrification is not happening nearly as fast as they had hoped or they had projected, right? So electricity demand certainly is either flat or the last couple of years down pretty dramatically. Yes, I live in Paris. I don't have air conditioning. We don't really need air conditioning, and that will change because there are a few days in the summer where you definitely want air conditioning. So they definitely are worried about that. But I think generally their load isn't growing, so they actually want their load to grow. On the other hand, they're trying to build all these renewables. If their load grows too fast, like through data centers, it's a huge pinch point. So what we're seeing in North America right now is the data center interconnection requests are kind of almost out of control. So in the United States, government plus industry is working together with hyperscalers and the data center owners, operators, so like Google and Meta, Microsoft, all these, trying to figure out how to give them enough energy in a reasonable amount of time. That's why you see all these things about them working with nuclear and whatever. So That they're also starting to see that in Europe. The only place in Europe where it's really intense right now is Ireland. Ireland already 25% of Irish electricity load is already data centers. And they're building so many, it'll be 33% they project by 2026. So Ireland is a tough spot. They're an island, they're an island, they're barely interconnected with anybody. They're building a new interconnect high voltage line to France, but and they're going 100% renewable. So Ireland's kind of in a tough place. How do you meet radically increased demand with intermittent supply? So it's EPRI Europe is based. EPRI's European operations are based in Dublin. We spent a lot of time with the TSO there, the transmission system operator and the utility, trying to learn lessons, because it's kind of almost a living lab like Hawaii is going to become as they go more and more renewable. So how do you go 100% renewable in the face of really increased demand? We're starting to see more increased demand of data center requests in France, in other places in Europe, not quite as extreme as Ireland. It is an issue. But I think what they're probably more worried about right now is, again, electricity is only 23% of final energy consumption. That's pretty much unchanged over the last 20 years, certainly over the last 10. They need that number to be much higher. Their load's not growing enough for them to actually decarbonize their whole economy, if that's their end goal. So they're prepared. And if you look at the big economy, I think another challenge that they have is really the scale of what they're trying to do. I mean, like the UK is a good example. UK is huge. Offshore wind, they have a lot of plants, right? They're trying to build, I think it was 30 gigawatts by 2030. And the new UK government, and then they raised it to 40 or something. The UK government came in this summer, raised it 60 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So, and right now they're only at 11. And so they got to build 50 more gigawatts of offshore wind. And that's daunting enough, but then they have to build the transmission backbone. So as you do this, if you put an insane increase, you really accelerate your deployment of intermittent resources, and your load is going up at the same time, where they're going to get squeezed is on transmission. So right now, and in fact, that's where another challenge comes into play, which is supply chain. So if you look at how many transformers you need to put into place to build that much transmission, free up the permitting and getting people, to agree for transmission. A lot of these transmission lines are going to be out at sea, subsea, but a lot of them are going to cross, some of the critical ones are going to cross land, and it's going to be very daunting, but they're just having trouble with supply chain. How do they get that many transformers secured and in place in the next 5 to 6 years? So I think Europe would like for their load to grow faster, but they're struggling just to keep up with the demand of what they're trying to build out right now. So, but you're right, air conditionings, people are going to use more and more air conditioning. There's a lot of countries in Europe where they don't even, I know, it's like the Bay Area, right? A lot of people out here never had air conditioning, and they're starting to get it because it gets hot sometimes now in the summer. So.
All right, so you can press on, Tom.
All right, good. So, all right, so let's talk about challenges. So we touched on a few. One of the biggest challenges Europe has right now, and there's this Mario Draghi, who was the former EU president, did a report that came out this summer, maybe this fall, on how Europe is falling behind China and the United States on competitiveness. And there's a lot of layers to this. It's interesting. I see this, working for EPRI in Europe a lot. First of all, Europeans, go to the universities, the companies, the startups, whatever, they're just as innovative as the US. They have brilliant professors, universities, they're doing amazing things. But for me, it's been hard to put my finger on it. Is it cultural? Some countries it's less of an issue than others. Or is it their inability to scale? Is it regulation? Is it something else? They have a really hard time in Europe, a lot, not just in energy, but in other things, scaling, taking an amazing breakthrough innovation, at least a basic R&D innovation, and actually getting it deployed at scale in a profitable way. I'd say a lot of China and US innovation when it comes to new markets, new technologies being deployed, a lot of those ideas actually come from Europe. Not most, obviously US is invented. has a lot of innovation. We're taking our own ideas and employing them, but a lot of European breakthroughs end up not directly benefiting European industry. So this Draghi report kind of hit on this. We've got smart people, we've got innovative people, but there's a gap between the breakthroughs we make and then being able to deploy them ourselves within Europe, whether it's defense technologies, energy technologies, medical technologies, whatever. They're as inventive as anybody else. They're very well educated. They're making great breakthroughs. That's a big gap. They've been having trouble, so there's a lot of recommendations in that report. How do we align decarbonization with competitiveness? And how do we make things more secure? When you really look at how this translates into energy, right now, China is with their industrial capacity. I mean, what's going on in China right now is amazing, but it's destroying. I mean, Europe, with all the subsidies that are going into clean energy technologies in Europe, it was one place that looked like Europe was leading, right? Solar, wind technology, and industries to back the building of these technologies and then also deploying them and other things, batteries, that sort of thing, EVs even. China is eating their lunch. China is scaling up. Yes, there's subsidies, there's other things, but if you look at how hyper-competitive the Chinese market is right now, they've driven the prices down on solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, even EVs. It's really leaving Europe even farther behind. Obviously, EVs are going to draw a line on because while they'll take the solar and the wind and the batteries to meet their clean target goals, EVs are all more politically sensitive. So, we're going to, they've already erected some trade barriers on EVs, kind of like the US has from China, and we're going to see more of that. The other pressure they're facing is the US Inflation Reduction Act. I can't tell you the last couple of years, whenever I'm talking in front of an audience there in Europe or just meeting somebody, it's the first thing they ask about. Tell us what's going on with the Inflation Reduction Act. For them, it's the giant sucking sound. The US, there's a lot of companies that you read this in the news. I've talked to the people on the ground. They're either moving their entire companies to the United States to take advantage of all these subsidies that the US has built in the IRA, or they were, you get many stories about, well, we're going to build a factory in Germany, but now we're going to build it here because the US is really the market we're going after. So there's a lot of frustration in Europe with the US Inflation Reduction Act. They're trying to do their own thing, but it's expensive. And again, that's tough for them to actually scale up. So if you look at the US, on one hand, you look at the US and our market looks like chaos, but that's what markets are, right? Every state on the regulatory level, every state has different ways. Some states are deregulated on the electricity side, some aren't. But you can scale up in the US, and with the IRA, it kind of juiced the whole effort. In Europe, every country, even though it's tops down, the original laws coming from the European Commission on liberalizing electricity and gas 20-25 years ago that came about very top down. So there's a lot more conformity country by country in Europe than state by state in the US in terms of approach to how they've unbundled their markets, what they're supposed to do to make certain competitive criteria. But they are very challenged with their companies are having trouble making money decarbonizing. They're doing it, but it's very tops down. In the US, you could say the IRA is tops down, but again, it's kind of a free-for-all, and people are getting incredibly inventive. I have a neighbor who's in my house in the US, which I don't live in anymore. He somehow managed to figure out how to pay no taxes by investing in I don't know, I guess a solar panel roof installer company in California, because they're doubling down on rebates from California, state of California, and from the US government. He's getting these huge rebates for his investment. Somehow that translates. He runs his own business, so he's able to cut it against his taxes. I don't know, it sounds kind of crazy to me, but when the European innovators and companies see that, they can go to US, they can get paid to decarbonize, develop their technologies further, deploy them, and end off more profitable and a better place. It's very frustrating for Europe. So that's a big challenge. And then also probably the other geopolitical thing that impacted them recently is definitely hurting their transition is, Russian gas being cut off. right? So gas is the ultimate flex resource when you're dropping lots and lots of renewables onto the system that are intermittent. Yeah, you can do it with batteries, but gas is really nice. Being able to use gas as your balance, that's really nice. So they've less gas now. Obviously, with the new administration next year, I would assume we can export even more U.S. gas to Europe, and that may become better for them. They'll be able to actually get a better price in gas and all that. So that could help them, and at least they're balancing and being able to do what they need to do. But it's a pretty big challenge. Kind of talked about the scale, the transmission build out, the supply chain. And supply chain is not just transformers, right? We see this in the US too, where supply chains kind of went upside down coming out of COVID, coming out of the pandemic. And you see this with the build outs, right? You see this in the US with offshore wind. You see it in Europe. They committed to a project, they got everything lined up, they're ready to go build, and all of a sudden supply chain went upside down, their costs increased by 50%, and all of a sudden that project they were going to do, whether it's offshore, solar, whatever, it's no longer in the money. They got to pull the plug. So obviously Europe is a little more hands-on, and so Europe's doing what it can to keep these projects on track. But yeah, it's very, very big challenge for them. The supply chains really undercut the profitability of some of these projects in a market that's not as hyper competitive as the US, where sometimes we find a way, because okay, we're not going to do offshore wind, we're going to move that money to something else, but we're still going to get a decarbonization hit. Another thing that's really is renewables permitting. We see this in the US, right? Transmission is tough. Renewables are tough, right? Connection requests or, transmission connection, interconnect requests for renewables, the queue's long. I think something like for wind on average, it's 7 years from the time you make the request. And think about it. They need to, double, quadruple, quintuple the renewables build over the next 5-6 years. And it takes them 7 years to get a request. If you have an idea now, if you have a site and everything else, you put an interconnection request in and you've got the money, it could take you 7 years to actually get that project to go forward to start construction. You're not even going to make your 2030 goals. So EU, the European Commission, is very aware of this. They've been pushing on this very hard. Even obviously the US is aware as well. I think the US is looking at doing it more for the sake of data centers, this huge wave of data center build out. Even in the Biden administration, they were looking at how do we streamline regulation, how we just kind of override local authority and all that. Easier said than done. In Europe, they're looking at something too, and I think they've made some progress. In Europe, part of the challenge is not unlike the US, but more so, 27, 29 countries, whatever it is, in the EU, they all have different rules for how you permit something. So you've got these companies that are transnational and multinational across Europe, and they're trying to do a project here, there, wherever else. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of red tape. And anybody who's trying to do business in Europe before knows there's a lot of bureaucracy there. Things can be tough in the US, complaining about bureaucracy and red tape in the US. You haven't seen nothing until you try to build something in Italy or France. It's really, really tough. And so they're counting on the market and they're counting on the energy companies to build an insane amount of renewables the next 6 years. They can't even get the permits through in a reasonable amount of time. Solar's a little faster, but anyways, that's a big challenge for them. I talked about electrification, how it's not moving fast enough, but they really have a lot of work to do. And again, they've got a lot of buildings they need to retrofit, but you kind of get this perfect storm of inflation. Energy costs went up a couple of years ago because of Russian gas. There's a lot of downward pressure on energy costs right now, which is good, but they're just getting uptake of electrification is very slow. I can say that somebody who drives an electric car in France, where EV penetration is higher than the US, UK as well, it should be easier to find a charging station. Obviously, when you're in your local community, it's pretty easy. I mean, a lot of multifamily dwelling in Europe, right? So you can't charge at home in most cases. People don't commute in their cars to work very much, so you can't charge at work. You got to find a charger. So you have to have a solution at home. And then when I'm on a road trip, I mean, I know there's no fumes in an EV, but sometimes it feels like I'm riding on fumes as I get to my next charger station. It's insane. I was driving through Wales a couple of weeks ago with an EV, and it was very hard to find a charger. You can find a drip charge, like a level 2, which doesn't really help you much if you're trying to get somewhere fast. So you have to find overnight solutions. It just takes a lot more work, and so the uptake is slow. Norway's an exception. EV, Norway's probably second only to China on EV uptake right now. China EVs are Market penetration is high and growing very quickly. Norway is actually a big success story, and they've kind of figured out the charging, but it's a small country. It's 5 million people. So they got a lot of way to go. Probably a big challenge that's really on the horizon, probably for all countries, certainly in Europe, is affordability. So we're asking people to change out their heating system, change out other things, change out their cars. Someone's got to pay for all these new transmission upgrades and everything else. Someone's got to pay for it. And so whether it's the customer, the electricity customer, the energy customer, or the taxpayer, somebody's paying. And so what we're seeing certainly in Europe, there's a lot of reasons. I'm not going to say we can simplify it to inflation and affordability, but the rise of the populist right in Europe, in places like France, in Germany, in Holland, in Italy, Austria, other places, certainly is fueled partially by affordability issues, inflation, other things. And they, I'm not making political judgments, but that side of the political spectrum in Europe tends to be less collaborative, right? Some of these parties want to pull out of the EU altogether. Some of them don't want to support subsidies for decarbonization. It's not their top priority, at least. They're probably a little bit more pro-subsidy for some level of energy transition than far-right parties in other countries, but it is a challenge. And so the European Commission, again, like all democracies, they have to play this game where they can't really put this on the backs of the energy customer too much, or else their whole world could change upside down, right? The whole construct, their whole goal for decarbonization, for energy transition, could become politically unpalatable and could collapse. Now, that being said, you go around Europe, you talk to people, there's very little climate change denial in Europe. And they're farther ahead than us in many ways at decarbonization, but that is certainly a very, very big challenge. And again, that constrains them a bit. They have to kind of find, so they've got all these challenges I talked about, right? So the scale is huge, permitting, supply chain, China, US, Russian gas, and somehow they got to make it affordable and decarbonize their economy by 55% compared to 1990 by 2030. It's almost like magic. I mean, right now, even people that are semi-honest will tell you there's no way they're going to hit 55%, but they might hit 51% or 50%. They're basically trending right now with the things they have in the pipeline. They could hit 50% plus by 2030, which would be amazing. I mean, you look at that chart of where they're already at, the first one I put up on the map, they're already ahead of most of the world, at least in their economic level at their level of GDP. It would be amazing if they could cut their carbon emissions, basically double their cuts over the next 6 years. That would be quite a feat, even if they come close, right? So it's a long game. They're aiming for 2050. They can get over 50% by 2030. That'd be pretty amazing. So I could keep talking about stuff, but I'm happy. I think that if I've taken more questions, I'm happy to go deep into some of these rabbit holes. I was trying to kind of put this out, just give you a sense of what's going on in Europe. It's okay. I didn't even talk about the election, right? They're completely freaking out about the American election, but it was much less of a shock to them. They're just in denial. So
here's a question in the chat box. Nick DeMarco, do you think U.S. RTOs could learn lessons from how Ireland is planning to scale its data center load growth?
Absolutely. So I can talk about that a little bit. So right now, Ireland we can learn from each other. Let's put it that way. So what Ireland has done so far and what they're faced with right now, I was with EirGrid maybe 2 months ago, talking to their one of their lead people trying to solve this problem, and they're working with Google and Microsoft and Meta daily trying to solve this, but it's very tough for them. So they've learned a lot of lessons, but they really want help. And so at least what EPRI's working on, a lot of other people are working on, but certainly EPRI has kind of put together a large collaborative of the hyperscalers like Google and Amazon, Meta, those folks, plus the data center folks, plus a lot of energy companies and ISO, RTO, TSOs around the world to really look at how how to make things more flexible. If you look at it from the US context, at least the current administration working at the industry really has 3 priorities to try to address this. And Ireland, when I'm talking to the Irish about this, they wish they could do that too. No one's done what the US government's trying to set out to do, or what the US industry is trying to set to do. Ireland is very much trying to, but we got to work together. And so there's 3 things. One, efficiency. And it's really what I'd call computational efficiency. And a lot of this is on the backs of the hyperscalers. How do we make the chips more energy efficient, which is happening, right? So NVIDIA was also working very closely with EPRI and many others on how to integrate this and make things more flexible. How do we make the chips more energy efficient, but also how do we make the computations? So if you think about AI, they're building these huge brains. It's very energy intensive. And that's one that takes a lot of gigawatts. But then whenever you make a request, like you're on a ChatGPT or Copilot or any of these, you make a request. Right now, on average, they're saying that one simple inference request to ChatGPT uses 10 times as much electricity as a Google request, just based on how much data they need, how the way thought goes. The latest version of ChatGPT now layers. If you think about if anybody's used these tools, usually don't just ask it one question. You ask it for something, and then you ask it for something in a different way. And you have a conversation, and after 5 or 10 requests, maybe you get what you want. That's 100 times more electricity than one Google request. What ChatGPT, what OpenAI has done, and I think many others are going to go this way as well, is they're layering it. So they're now anticipating your 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th request, and they're just sandwiching it all together. So you make one request, you get a much better answer, but maybe it's 50 times the electricity of the Google request. Their challenge will be both on building the brain that does all this stuff, and then on the request side, how do we make that more energy efficient, right? It's in everybody's interest. It's in their interest because they can't win the AI war. None of these companies, hyperscalers, can be able to win the AI battle to come out on top of AI or stay ahead of AI if they can't figure out how to get more data centers up faster. And there's only so much energy that can be put up so fast. So the person who figures out how to make things more computationally efficient, in addition to what NVIDIA is doing with chips, you can win. If you can figure out how to do these calculations, computations a lot more energy efficiently and shortcut things, whether it's how you build the brain or how you handle our inference requests, right now that's the direction things are going. So that's something Ireland can't do by itself. So there's like a global collaborative now that's working with the hyperscalers to let them know that's their part of it. The other thing in the US, the White House has been looking at is how to bring as much energy to bear to support these data centers as fast as possible. Obvious, right? So in the US, what does that mean? It means we're building a lot of gas really fast. If anybody's paying attention, right? We're building a lot of gas right now. We're deferring coal plant retirements. Everybody knows about that. And then, of course, the hyperscalers are working with nuclear and geothermal. Anyone they can get their hands on, they're working on bringing more things back or bringing more things to bear. But this also has to do with transmission. You can't build transmission overnight. So, one of the big projects we're working on is on grid enhancing technologies. How do you accelerate deployment of grid enhancing technologies so you can take existing rights of way and you can double throughput or increase it by 40% or whatever quickly this year? And so you're going to see a lot of pressure and also goes to permitting. How do they short circuit permits to just get things built faster? You're going to see a lot of that. Ireland's doing that. We're doing that in the US. The third is really using data centers as a grid resource. And so this one large collaborative EPRI has focused on that. This is something the hyperscalers, Ireland needs it, we need it. The hyperscalers don't really want to do, right? Because if you first of all, you do the obvious thing, you do demand response with data centers, they got to shut down to shave peak. They don't want to do that. To win, they need to be on 24/7, right? We've done demonstrations where they've shown that they can move calculations from one facility to another. So if there's demand, if there's high electricity demand or there's a tight margins in one part of the country or one country, they've already shown they can move the calculations. They can basically shift the workload from that place to another place. But right now, they don't even have enough data centers to win their thing. So they don't really want to be flexible in that sort of way. So we're working on with them because that might be the cost of them getting connected quicker, getting more data centers up faster. Because right now, their pinch point is getting enough energy fast. So they don't want to be flexible in that sort of way, but they're still willing to work with us on that, especially if the market pays them in some way to shut down. But of course, when you're Google and Meta, you don't really care about the money. You want to get things built as fast as possible and get calculations done as quickly as possible, as much as possible. The other way really is really interesting, I think, for engineers on the energy side, which is how do you basically make like virtual power plants, right? So how right now they use backup generation for data centers. It's mostly diesel, right? They've got backup diesels in case the power goes out because they want to keep the thing on. How do we switch that to microturbines, to other things, batteries plus renewables, so that you can actually make that data center energy sort of part of the backup system, right? So if you have a demand constraint, or you have some sort of constraint, instead of the data center shutting down, it just switches to backup power. But it switches to clean backup power that's not an issue, right? They're not firing diesels up. They're going to a gas microturbine. They're going to their batteries. We're working with them on that. That's very important. How do you make that a more flexible resource that will let them get interconnected faster? And so they're very interested in that sort of thing. Ireland is as well, right? Again, Ireland they're building all these renewables. They're intermittent. They're an island nation. They need flexibility. They need these data centers to be flexible. They're already at 25% of load. It's going to be 33%. Close your eyes. It's 2030. They're at 50%. Those data centers better be really, really flexible in a way that the hyperscalers like Google can live with, which is tough. So anyways, hopefully I answered the question. We can definitely learn from each other. RTOs are working, our US RTOs are already working with EPRI.
So questions from the audience? If you have a question, and put it in the chat box, or please unmute yourself and ask the question. All right. Any
I have a
questions?
question.
Okay. Yes, go ahead, please.
I see like top wealth people are most interested in energy transition. They are investing in energy. And do you think is how it will be helpful for energy particular?
Say, I didn't quite understand that. Say that again.
I see that top like in India at least top wealthy people are most interested in energy transition. And do you see that as a positive sign and how it will help overall picture?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously, India is building a lot of coal plants. And, because India is growing quickly. So India needs a lot of energy. They need all of the above, right? They're building a lot of coal. And I was talking to folks from NTPC, the large utility in India a couple of months ago. I was talking to them about data centers. And they're like, yeah, we'll just build another coal plant. They're living in a different world than we're living in the US or Europe. But they're building so many coal plants so fast. They're very interested in energy transition, right? I mean, they realize building coal as fast as they're building is not really sustainable, not just for climate commitments, but just, it's not a diversified portfolio strategy. And they're putting running those coal plants 20, 30 years from now is going to become increasingly difficult in a global context. So they're very interested. I think India's, again, very, I don't know, Rudy, the last time I looked at it, I think something like India grads rate, I don't know, I think graduating like 1 million engineers a year or something like this. I mean, it's insane how much brain power there is in India. And if you talk to some of these companies, they are really working on energy transition solutions, at least at a micro level. They're very proud of some of the things they're doing, at least on the grid side. They're trying to deploy other things, but again, they're kind of squeezed a bit like China might have been a few years back, where they need so much power so fast, they need all of the above. So they're building a lot of coal. At the same time, they're looking at how do we build out renewables? How do we build out other things? So I know they're very interested. But they've got a lot of demand and a lot of load that they've got to serve. And so obviously they're going to expand their nuclear as well, other things.
Questions for Tom?
Hi, this is Nick DeMarco. I just thought it'd be easier to ask rather than typing.
Sure.
But if you could quickly describe, I guess, how data centers are treated, like are they treated as a separate customer class in Europe or by country, and how heavy are they being leaned on to provide money for the transmission and generation solutions they're required?
That's it. That's a great question. I obviously I think some of us might be very familiar about what's going on state by state in the U.S., where the certainly the Googles and these folks are desperately trying to avoid being treated as a different class. That being said, they're willing to pay a premium for power and to be very flexible in regulation. They're very leery of being treated as a different class. In Ireland, I'm actually not sure what the answer to that question is. They are certainly de facto being treated as a different class because technically there's a moratorium on data centers in Ireland, and it's a very leaky moratorium right now. In terms of getting them to pay for the transmission, I actually don't know what premium they're paying. I think historically they have not been, but I think that's kind of subject to negotiations. They might have already agreed to something or been forced to pay up something, but that's a good question. I can look into that. Certainly for the rest of Europe, it's not as big of an issue yet. Ireland, if you look at in the US, the state, there's only a couple of states that are even close to where Ireland's at, right? I think Virginia, 21% of load is data centers right now. And at least in some of the regions like Northern Virginia, they're starting to choke on that a little bit. And Ireland is choking. So the deal that I don't think they've made yet will be definitely, if they want to build more data centers, they're going to really have to pay up to pay for all, to make sure that it doesn't get done on the backs of the customers. Other places we're seeing it like France, UK a little bit. It's not big enough yet for it to become a kind of cross subsidization issue, but it will be, I'm sure, eventually.
Thank you very much. I work
Sure.
for the Pennsylvania Office of Consumer Advocate, so
Okay.
we're starting to see an inkling of that, especially in PJM. So
Yeah.
thanks.
Yep, no problem. Happy to. And again, I tried to make this very tight. Rudy said I could only talk for an hour, so I could have did a much longer discussion on things, but I was trying to give you a whirlwind, discussion about where they are, especially for folks that aren't familiar with what the European energy situation is and where they're going and how difficult it's going to be. I would say that I do have pretty good confidence they're going to make amazing progress the next 5 or 6 years. They're not going to make as much progress as they want. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be pricey, but I think, they'll look back in 2030 and there'll be a lot of pain, but I think they'll have made a lot of progress. And like everything else, the question is, like your last question, who's going to pay for it? So right now it's governments and again, transmission is going to be tricky.
Questions for Tom? Tom, this question is, the discussion, NVIDIA seems to be a big player in this. And, we are, on one hand, we are afraid about the demand for electricity is going to blow up. If AI is introduced, used much more in the industry. But he's also the CEO of NVIDIA. Did say that they're probably working on a chip that is less power consuming, and it could follow the same trajectory as Moore's law. We were always afraid that, for doing faster computation, you need bigger chips or whatever.
Yeah. In fact, we get that question in Europe a lot. I mean, I think a lot of you folks like in Pennsylvania and other states, we're already seeing utilities are, I wouldn't say we're freaking out a little, the utilities are there. It's like, how the heck do I deal with this and keep almost the rest of my commitments? Yes, NVIDIA also with their most recent chip launch got a very good, energy efficiency gain. And Jensen Huang is definitely very ambitious. And I honestly think very impressively, I think they'll probably overachieve. So there may be a sort of Moore's law in this space, which is really just a continuation of Moore's law, if you think about it, right? So, but the challenge is, right now at least, for the next few years, the appetite, the need to grow is faster. And like everything else in life, well, depends. If you have very, I would say almost unlimited appetite, you need to grow fast, fast, fast. The cheaper those chips become in energy usage terms, the more chips people are going to demand, right? So if he doubles energy efficiency of these chips, he better be prepared to sell twice as many chips, because that's what's coming. And so, and obviously this is not a new story. We've seen chips become much more energy efficiency, at least in terms of per calculation, for a long time. That's what Moore's law was about, basically, right? It wasn't about the energy so much as the computation, but it's very similar. Now they're focused more on energy efficiency, but what we're seeing is the power densities are getting, they're just going to build bigger and bigger data centers, is our sense, right? They're already looking at tremendously big ones. And so, you know, if you talk to Google or Meta or Microsoft, they've got plans, they've got stuff they need to build now, and then they've kind of got this frontier AI stuff they're looking at over the next 3 years. They're looking at building a lot more over the next 5 years. We'll see where that goes. Certainly, energy efficiency of the chips is going to help a lot. But right now, if you provided these folks with chips that were twice as energy efficient as they are now, they probably buy twice as many. That's what would happen right now. Because their limiting factor is energy. If they had all the energy in the world, they'd be building a lot more data centers right now. That's all.
So, Tom, again, not specifically in Europe, what are the utility, the executives, what are they looking for from AI that is going to reduce their cost of operation tremendously? What is the big thing they're hoping for? Or what are the big things?
Well, I mean, obviously you've got some CEOs that are looking at it from the other side. They're hoping to use AI to make their operations more efficient, right? As tapping the technology itself to be able to run plants more efficient, run grids more efficient, like we all are. But on the Grid Connect side, it really depends where you sit, right? If you are an energy supplier or somebody who knows how to build nuclear plants or knows how to build geothermal plants and get them online, you're in a good position, because these data centers, at least for the next couple of years, probably longer, going to pay you a premium to get that stuff on fast and make firm power commitments. So we're already seeing this with some of the existing nuclear plants. You've got one in your neighborhood there at Susquehanna where I guess they're working with Amazon to try to do something. We also see 3 Mile Island, which is close to you guys, that, Microsoft is paying, and they're paying a premium, right? They need this power. And the beautiful thing, in a way, for folks who care about decarbonization is Google, Microsoft, even Meta and Amazon are very committed to this concept of 24/7 carbon free, right? So right now, they're fairly carbon free if you squint just right, because they're buying a lot of credits. But Microsoft, I guess, Google, I'm trying to remember, Google's carbon emissions over the last 5 years, increased 40-some% as they build out more data centers. Microsoft's up 30%. They're going the opposite direction of where they want to be by 2030, which is 24/7 carbon-free energy. So if you're a provider on the supply side, which a lot of these utilities are, although I know they're unbundled in Pennsylvania and other places, but if you're on the supply side, like Constellation, which is near you guys all over, you know how to run nuclear. You're really interested in building more new nuclear, or if you're interested in building new geothermal, interested in building pump storage, batteries, solar with storage, whatever, you're in a happy place, right? The IRA is going to shower credits on you. Google's going to pay you 50% premium. Those guys are happy if you have a position. If you are on the grid side, kind of freaking out right now, like PJM, right? Or any of the utilities that are involved that own transmission, it's like, wow, how do I get this power from A to B? So that's why we're seeing a lot of interest on the grid side to like grid enhancing technologies. How do we actually facilitate this? And one of the things we're working on the hyperscalers are, how do we get them so, for lack of a better word, how do we get them more flexible about where they put these data centers? So a lot of reasons they want data centers close to major trunks of data trunks, because they're worried about latency on at least the back end on the inference requests, the search requests. on the front end, when they're training the brains, they're more flexible. So if they're looking at places like North Dakota to build the brains, right, where power's cheap, they can build wind, whatever. So I get supply side, you're happy. Grid side, you're freaking out. That's what I'd say.
Thank you. Questions for Tom?
Just only I have a question.
Sure.
Hi,
Yeah.
my name is Sajjad Al-Shumari. I'm a student in energy system. I have a question. If, in your opinion, after 2030, what will be increased? The gas turbine or the nuclear? If the wind turbine, it is not getting the point.
Well, that's $1 million question. So I think we're going to see lots of gas built out, just because as we put more and more renewables online. And at the end of the day, when you're an energy provider, electricity provider, your job, your number one job, your number two job, your number three job is reliability of power. And at the same time, you got to make that as affordable as possible. Gas is a beautiful thing from that perspective, right? It's reliable and it's affordable. You're going to see a lot of it, at least balancing out. Now, obviously, renewables, solar and wind, as they come online, they're also can be very affordable in terms of energy. Well, in terms of having access to energy, but it's the reliability of wind and solar, which you've got to balance with something, batteries, or other forms of storage. You view natural gas as just another form of storage, right? You can put gas somewhere, you can sit on it, you can use it when you need it. That is, so at least in the US, it's going to be hard to imagine gas use really going down in the short to medium term. Even in the longer term, in most of the modeling that we looked at in the US, and I would think if they're honest, they also need to do in Europe, you're going to need gas at least as a backup, right? So maybe, and then the question is who pays for it? But maybe you distribute it. Maybe you have backup power becomes a combination of storage and micro turbines for large industrials, and utility, system operators can start tapping the batteries and the micro turbines in real emergencies. So you're almost never using gas 25, 30 years from now, but you have it there if you need it. If the wind doesn't blow, if you have a wind drought for a week, or there's no sun, or not much sun for a few days, and your storage capacity is tapped, you might have gas as a backup in some places. So it's hard to imagine gas going away completely as at least a backup fuel that you try never to use 30 years from now. Certainly 5, 10 years from now, we're gonna have a lot of gas being used actively. So, and if nuclear can come online, that would be great because you'll still need a little gas, but you need less.
Thanks.
Questions for Tom? Okay, there are no other questions. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Sure.
As usual, very entertaining and very informative talk. And, I know that you had a long night, several time zones.
Yeah.
And so, we'll get you back for maybe a deeper dive into some of the things that you brought up.
Sure.
Folks, this is our last seminar for the semester, December 2nd. We have a speaker from TVA. They just won a whopping big project with the Department of Energy under the GRIPS program, Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnerships. I think this is a program where they're working with all their distributors. They have 155 distributors, to answer this question, to increase the grid resilience, especially as we come to, advance in the climate changing world. So that's 2 weeks from now, December 2nd, 2 weeks from now, I think, December 2nd. And the speaker is Cynthia Herron. So we'll see you at the next seminar and wish you all the best for the week, and see you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Hey, Rudy, I had to step away for a couple minutes.
Okay. Hey, I kept getting this warning about it's going to start updating my Windows.
Oh.
I think I might as well, I'll update it so it doesn't bother me. It comes, I try to, I take it off the screen. It comes back, in 5 minutes.
Let me stop the recording.